On the morning of June 25th, 2009, two of the most famous people in the world died within hours of each other. One of them got almost all of the coverage. One of them was forgotten almost before the day was over. The one who was forgotten had, just 6 weeks earlier, done something that no celebrity in American history had ever done before. She had picked up a camera, pointed it at herself, and filmed her own dying. Not for sympathy, not for attention, as an act of pure defiance. As a way of saying, this is what cancer actually looks like, and if the world is going to watch me disappear, then I am going to make sure it sees the truth. Her name was Farrah Fawcett, and the version of her that the world remembers, the red swimsuit, the feathered hair, the most famous poster of the 1970s, is the smallest and least interesting thing about who she actually was. Behind that image was a woman who walked away from the biggest television show in America at the height of her fame, because she refused to be only what it was making her, who fought one of the most powerful producers in Hollywood through the courts and won, who reinvented herself as a serious dramatic actress when the industry had decided she was only decorative, who spent the last 3 years of her life filming her own cancer treatment because she wanted to leave behind something true rather than something palatable, and who died in the arms of a man whose relationship with her was so complicated, so painful, and so defining of her adult life that understanding it is the only way to understand her. This is the real story of Farrah Fawcett, and it begins not in Hollywood, but in a small Texas city, with a girl who was so beautiful from the time she was born that strangers stopped her mother on the street to say she looked like an angel. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, stories about women the world reduced to a single image, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and turn on notifications. Every week we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a headline. Now, back to Farrah. She was born Mary Farrah Lenny Fawcett on February 2nd, 1947, in Corpus Christi, Texas, the second daughter of Jim Fawcett, an oil field contractor, and his wife Pauline, a homemaker. She grew up in a warm, close, deeply Catholic household in South Texas, where her extraordinary beauty was simply a fact of life that the family accepted, with the matter-of-fact attitude of people who had grown up around it. She was voted most beautiful by her classmates for 3 consecutive years in high school. When she arrived at the University of Texas at Austin to study microbiology, she was voted most beautiful in her freshman year, a distinction so rare for a first-year student that it generated press coverage across the state. A photograph of her was sent to various Hollywood agencies by the university itself. One of those photographs landed on the desk of David Mirisch, a Los Angeles publicist who represented Perry Como, Pat Boone, and Omar Sharif. He called her at her dormitory and spent the better part of 2 years trying to convince her to move to Hollywood. She asked him to call her father. She resisted. She was studying art by then, having changed her major, and she had a genuine creative life that was not centered on being looked at. She eventually agreed, at the end of her junior year, to go to Los Angeles temporarily, to test the waters, as she put it, before returning to finish her degree. She never went back. Within days of arriving in Hollywood, she was signed by Screen Gems to a contract at $350 a week. She began appearing in commercials, in television guest spots, in small film roles. She was luminous on camera, in the specific way that very few people are the kind of luminous where the camera seems to find her, even when the scene is supposed to be about someone else. In 1973, she married Lee Majors, the actor who had recently become one of the biggest stars on American television, through his role in The $6 Million Man. The marriage gave her a degree of industry credibility and stability. It also defined her, at least in the minds of the people around her, primarily as someone's wife, a characterization she would spend years trying to move past. The opportunity that changed everything came in 1976, when producer Aaron Spelling cast her as one of 3 female private detectives in a new ABC series called Charlie's Angels. She played Jill Monroe. The show premiered on September 22, 1976. It became the most watched new series on television that season. The Farrah Fawcett poster was released at almost exactly the same moment. She wore a red one-piece swimsuit. She was smiling directly at the camera. By the end of 1977, it had sold 6 million copies. Eventually, the number reached 12 million. It remains one of the most reproduced commercial photographs in American history. She was everywhere. Her face was on lunchboxes, t-shirts, pillowcases, wigs. Department stores sold Farrah Fawcett hairstyle kits. Women across America asked their hairdressers for the Farrah. Her name had become, within approximately 8 months of Charlie's Angels premiering, a cultural shorthand for a specific kind of 1970s female beauty. And then, at the end of that first season, she quit. This decision to walk away from the most popular show in America at the peak of her fame is the first and most revealing thing Farrah Fawcett ever did that told you who she actually was beneath the poster. Aaron Spelling's production company sued her for breach of contract, claiming she was bound by her agreement regardless of the season ending. The case went to trial. It was settled out of court, with Fawcett agreeing to appear in 6 additional guest episodes over the following years. She had won the essential argument. She was not going back as a regular cast member. Why did she leave? Because she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had been looked at her entire life, that Charlie's Angels was a machine for producing images of her, rather than a vehicle for anything she actually wanted to do. She had not moved from Texas to Hollywood to stand in front of a camera in a tight jumpsuit and be photographed. She had come, whatever the industry thought she was, because she believed she was capable of something more than that. The decision also said something specific about her relationship with Lee Majors, which was quietly coming apart during this same period. Majors had been, in many respects, the person who had guided her early Hollywood years. He was older, established, connected, and she had arrived in the industry as his girlfriend and then his wife. That positioning had given her access. It had also placed her in a supporting role in her own career, someone defined by her proximity to a famous man, rather than by whatever she was building independently. Walking away from Charlie's Angels was, in part, walking away from that structure. She was making a declaration about whose name was going to matter. Her own, on her own terms, in projects she had chosen for herself. The industry, which had spent a year benefiting enormously from the commercial machinery built around her image, responded to this declaration with the contempt that Hollywood has historically reserved for women who presume to redirect their own careers. The 3 films that followed her departure were reviewed as evidence that she had been wrong about herself. Critics who had praised the show without attributing any of its success to her specific contribution now suggested that her specific contribution to it had been nothing more than looks and timing. She filed that away, and she kept working. The years immediately after Charlie's Angels tested that belief severely. 3 films in rapid succession, Somebody Killed Her Husband, Sunburn, and Saturn III were either critical or commercial failures, or both. The press, which had been so enthusiastic about her during the Charlie's Angels period, was gleeful about what it characterized as the inevitable collapse of a television celebrity who had overestimated herself. She was not done. She simply had not yet found the right material. The material came in 1983, when she was cast in the stage play Extremities, playing a woman who survives an attempted rape and turns the tables on her attacker. Critics who had spent years dismissing her as a decorative presence were startled by what they saw. The New York Times said she was astonishing. She was nominated for a Golden Globe. The following year, 1984, she played Francine Hughes in The Burning Bed, a television film about a woman who, after years of violent abuse from her husband, set his bed on fire while he slept, and then turned herself in to the police. The real Francine Hughes had been acquitted by reason of temporary insanity, in a verdict that had galvanized public debate about domestic violence in America. Farrah Fawcett's performance in The Burning Bed drew the largest television movie audience in more than a decade. 40 million people watched it. Critics called it the finest performance of the year in any medium. She was nominated for an Emmy Award. In the days after it aired, domestic violence hotlines across the country reported significant increases in calls from women seeking help. Shelters reported increases in walk-ins. The film had done something real. Farrah Fawcett had done something real. And the woman who had been written off as a poster girl had turned herself into something the industry had not seen coming. Now we need to talk about Ryan O'Neal, because his presence in her life is inseparable from the story of who she became and what the final chapter of her life looked like. She had met O'Neal in the late 1970s, during the period of her separation from Lee Majors. He was one of the most celebrated actors in America, famous for Love Story and Paper Moon, and he pursued her with the same intensity he brought to everything he did. They began a relationship that would last on and off for the better part of 30 years. The relationship was not a simple one. O'Neal was volatile. He had a history of physical altercations, including a documented incident involving his own son, Griffin. He had complicated relationships with his children from multiple partners. His relationship with Farrah moved through periods of genuine closeness and genuine difficulty, separating and reconnecting over the decades in ways that the people who cared about her found hard to watch. In 1985, their son Redmond was born. The child gave the relationship an anchor it had not had before, but it did not resolve the fundamental tensions. They separated again in the mid-1990s and did not reconnect until the early 2000s. Redmond O'Neal's story is one of the more heartbreaking threads in Farrah Fawcett's biography. He struggled with addiction throughout his adolescence and young adulthood, and the combination of his parents' complicated relationship and his own serious problems created a pattern of crisis and intervention that consumed significant amounts of his mother's emotional energy during the years she should have been concentrating on her own health. When she was diagnosed with cancer in 2006, Redmond was in and out of legal trouble. He was arrested multiple times. He was incarcerated at various points during her illness. There is documented evidence that she spent portions of her final years managing his situation from her hospital bed, making phone calls and arrangements for her son, while simultaneously managing her own treatment and her own dying. She never stopped being his mother, even when she was dying. This detail, which rarely appears in the mainstream accounts of her final years, is one of the most revealing things about who Farrah Fawcett actually was. The poster version of her suggests someone for whom life was easy and beautiful and externally validated. The real version was a woman who spent her final years fighting cancer, managing her son's crisis, navigating a complicated 30-year relationship, and simultaneously producing the most honest documentary about serious illness that American television had broadcast all at the same time. What is documented about the relationship during these years? from multiple accounts by people who knew them both, is that O'Neill could be controlling in ways that limited her professional choices and her personal freedom. Her close friend Alana Stewart has described periods during which Farrah felt hemmed in, restricted, unable to make decisions about her own career and her own life without negotiating his approval. Farrah Fawcett was also, throughout all of this, working. She did not stop. She appeared in films and television movies throughout the 1980s and 1990s, with the steady determination of someone who understood that her presence in the industry depended entirely on her own continued effort rather than on any lasting goodwill from an establishment that had always been ambivalent about her. In 1997, Robert Duvall cast her in The Apostle, a film he had been developing for years about a Southern Pentecostal preacher. She played his wife. Critics who reviewed the film placed her performance alongside Duvall's own as one of the two finest in the picture. It was, by any measure, a serious dramatic role in a serious film, performed with the craft and commitment of someone who had spent 20 years working toward exactly this kind of material. The industry did not particularly notice. The awards conversation centered on Duvall. Farrah Fawcett's performance in The Apostle remains one of the most under-recognized pieces of work in the career of any American actress of her era. In 2006, she was diagnosed with anal cancer. The diagnosis came during a period when she and O'Neill had reconnected after their long separation. He moved in with her. He drove her to her appointments. He stayed beside her through the treatments and the surgeries and the terrible uncertainty of a disease that was responding and then not responding, and then partially responding in ways that made it almost impossible to plan anything or believe anything consistently. She decided to film it. This decision, made almost immediately after the diagnosis, was entirely hers. She began with a handheld camera she operated herself, recording her doctor visits, her treatment sessions, her reflections on what she was going through. She then asked her friend Alana Stewart to take over the camera duties because she wanted her own hands free and because she trusted Alana to see what she saw. When Stewart raised concerns about filming certain moments that felt too invasive, too raw, too painful to document, Farrah told her, "Film it. This is what cancer is." That sentence is everything you need to know about who Farrah Fawcett had become by 2006. She was 60 years old. She had spent her entire adult life being filmed, photographed, and documented in ways she had not controlled and had not chosen. Now, at the end of her life, she was choosing exactly what the camera would see. She was making the record on her own terms. The documentary that resulted, Farrah's Story, aired on NBC on May 15, 2009. 9 million people watched it. It showed her with a shaved head. It showed her in pain. It showed her receiving treatment in Germany, where she had sought alternative therapies when the American protocols had not achieved the results she needed. It showed the real texture of what serious illness does to a human body and a human life, without the managing and softening and rearranging that celebrity coverage had always performed on her image. 6 weeks after the documentary aired, on June 25, 2009, Farrah Fawcett died in a Santa Monica hospital. She was 62 years old. Ryan O'Neill was beside her. She died in his arms, according to the account he gave afterward. And then Michael Jackson died later the same day. He died at approximately 2:26 in the afternoon, Pacific time. Farrah Fawcett had died at approximately 9:28 in the morning. She had been gone for nearly 5 hours before Jackson's cardiac arrest occurred. But the news cycle does not work on a first-come, first-served basis. Jackson's death was one of the most seismic celebrity events in American history. Within hours of the announcement, Television networks had cleared their schedules. Newspapers were reconfiguring their front pages. The internet, which in 2009 was already shaping how stories were consumed, generated traffic so overwhelming that multiple major websites temporarily crashed. Farrah Fawcett, who had spent 3 years documenting her own cancer battle and who had aired a documentary 6 weeks earlier that 9 million people had watched, was reduced in the coverage to a sentence or two. The woman who had specifically wanted to control her own narrative, who had picked up a camera and filmed the truth of her own dying so that it would be on record, was a footnote within hours of being gone. Her friends were devastated by this. Alana Stewart later said that it had felt like a second loss, not just losing Farrah, but watching her immediately disappear from the conversation she had worked so hard to shape. The coverage of Jackson's death was so overwhelming, so total, so all-consuming, that Farrah Fawcett's death was essentially pushed off the front pages within hours. A woman who had spent 3 years documenting her own cancer battle and producing one of the most honest pieces of television about serious illness that American broadcasting had ever aired was reduced to a footnote in her own death notice because of the timing. Her close friends found this almost unbearable. Alana Stewart spoke about it publicly and with barely contained fury. Kate Jackson and Jaclyn Smith, her original Charlie's Angels co-stars, both made public statements. But the news cycle had moved on. She was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Ryan O'Neal, who died in December 2023, is buried beside her. History has given Farrah Fawcett a particular legacy. The poster, the hair, the Angels, a television movie that changed the public conversation about domestic violence, a cancer documentary that changed how Americans thought about illness. What history has not given her is a full accounting of who she actually was. She was a woman from Texas who was so beautiful from birth that the world had decided what she was before she could decide anything for herself. She spent her entire career fighting that decision. She walked away from the most popular show in America because she had more to offer than it required of her. She stood in the theater night after night in a physically demanding role and made critics who had written her off sit up and reconsider everything they had assumed. She picked up a camera at the end of her life and made the most honest documentary about cancer that American television had broadcast. Because she was not willing to disappear quietly in the way the world had decided famous women were supposed to disappear. She was also, for 30 years, in a relationship that cost her more than she let most people see. That shaped her choices in ways she could not always articulate. That gave her something she genuinely needed and took something she genuinely needed in different measures at different times. The full truth of it is something only she knew completely. She once said, in one of the last interviews she gave, "I think people see what they want to see. They saw the poster. I always hoped they would see past it. Some of them did. Not enough. Not while she was alive." Before we close, if you have stayed this far and this story has moved you, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to Behind the Pearls. Every week, we tell the stories of the women the world reduced to a single image. She was born in Corpus Christi to people who loved her. She was told by the world what she was before she was old enough to disagree. She disagreed anyway throughout her entire career, with the specific stubbornness of someone who had always known there was more to give than what was being asked for. She filmed her own dying because she wanted the truth on record. She got that. She earned that. Film it. This is what cancer is. That sentence is her legacy. Every bit as much as the poster. Behind the Pearls exists for this. For the women who were reduced to images and spent their lives trying to be seen as something more. for the ones who told the truth when the truth was hard, for the ones who were forgotten on the day they died because somebody more famous died the same afternoon. Farrah Fawcett deserved to be the story. She was the story, and her story is just as extraordinary. I will see you there.